welcome. Can everybody hear me? All right, excellent. My name is Nikki Lefebvre. I'm the director of the Natick Historical Society. We were established in 1870, and today we remain an independent nonprofit that receives no public funds. So we are delighted to be supported by the generosity of our community members. And I always like to start off events by offering them a round of applause for thanks for making events like these possible. So thank you to all of our supporters. We appreciate it. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's event is being recorded by our local cable station, Natick Pegasus, so please be aware of that. I also want to draw your attention, this speech, and there are copies of the speech. If you didn't pick one up, there are copies over at the table to my left. The final paragraph of the speech does involve everybody chiming in to speak together, so please do feel free to join our last reader in making that last paragraph really a group effort. Thank you. I am especially excited to be here tonight for a community read of Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to a Slave is the 4th of July." And I want to thank Mass Humanities for inspiring community reads of this important speech across the Commonwealth. You can go to Mass Humanities and find out where more readings are taking place. It's a wonderful program, and they have made available resources like the speech that you are reading now and that you're about to hear read to you. I also want to thank the many organizations and people in Natick who have supported this event, whether through encouraging words or spreading the word and helping us reach local people who are happy to join us as readers. We've been connected with some really impressive teens that you'll see here tonight and some special guest readers from local community organizations that are invested in the principles and values of this speech. So also a big thanks to Natick Pegasus, because their support in making this reading accessible to those who don't feel comfortable being here or for whom it's just too hot, and will be able to hear this speech read aloud from the comfort of their own homes. Thank you, Natick Pegasus. You are always an incredible partner. And finally, I'm honored to be here in the presence tonight of some really wonderful teens and guest speakers who are willing to read, and it does take courage to stand up and read words written over 150 years ago. So I really applaud them for their efforts and thank them all for being here. After the speech is read, I will recognize each of our readers by name, but for now I'd like to introduce Professor Brenna Greer, who has joined us to set the stage for the reading and will kick off the speech as our first special guest reader. Brenna Greer is an historian of race, gender, and culture in the 20th century United States, who explores historical connections between capitalism, social movements, and visual culture. Her first book, Represented: The Black Image Makers Who Reimagined African American Citizenship, examines the historical circumstances that made the media representation of black citizenship good business in the post-World War II era. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Nation, Daily Mail, Enterprise and Society, and Columbia Journalism Review. As an associate professor in the Department of History at Wellesley College, Greer teaches courses on World War II, the Cold War, the Black freedom struggle, consumerism and capitalism, and visual culture. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Greer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Natick Historical Society and especially Nikki Lefebvre for asking me to do this this year. And I will, in a couple of minutes, as she said, kick off the special reading of Frederick Douglass' most famous essay, What to the American Slave is the 4th of July. And then the students gathered here will finish that. And I really do also want to thank the students, even though you can't see them yet. I want to thank them because I do really consider this to be community service. And it's my hope that this is the second annual of many annual readings of this essay. Some of you may know that I was here last year. I actually did the opening remarks last year for this event. And it was a very different kind of vibe then. At that point, we'd been sheltering in place, I think, for about 3 months, and COVID deaths were mounting exponentially each day. And in fact, the date was July 2nd when we did this last time, and that was the highest the highest spike in new cases on that very day. So we're in a different moment right here, and I can remember that I was sitting on that bench by myself, masked, waiting to speak, and then once I was done speaking, I skirted the audience as I was instructed to do, and there were people, scattered on the lawn like they are now. But I'm happy to actually see people's faces below the nose or below the eyes this year, and to know that this isn't going to be the last time for months and months that I'm actually gathered with people, so that is also nice. So thank you for being my first kind of communal group. By way of orienting you for this speech, some of you may not be familiar, but Frederick Douglass delivered this, again, his most famous address on Monday, July 5th, Monday because the 4th was a Sunday, in 1852 in Rochester, New York, at the invitation of the Rochester's Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society, which I always find interesting. And at the time, Douglass, who had escaped slavery in 1838, so 14 years prior, was the most famous black person on the planet, which had everything to do with his international campaign against slavery and also his abolitionist writings and his oratory as well. Also, it's interesting to note that Douglass embraced photography, and so he described it as a democratic art and found it to be really important to African Americans. So he's also the most photographed person of any race of the 19th century, which also contributed to his fame. And so as you will hear with his address, Douglass eschewed the sentimentalist or triumphalist rhetoric that's typical to 4th of July speeches, and he instead focused on slavery, which he cast as a grotesque, offensive, and deadly contradiction to the nation's founding principles of liberty, justice, and equality. And what to the slave is the 4th of July was an indictment, his indictment of white America, but more than that, it was an indictment of American democracy, which Douglass tied to as dependent on the unfreedom of blacks. Now, I would never compare black Americans' current circumstances to those that Douglass was describing in his 1852 essay. But I do feel, particularly after this last year, that it's a very fair question to ask what to black Americans in the 21st United States is the 4th of July. And I ask this question because over this past year, the triple pandemics of COVID-19, police brutality, and white supremacy have made it abundantly clear that while the coronavirus may be loosening its grip, we remain as a nation plagued by yet another pandemic, which is racism, both systemic and extremist. And this has been revealed in inequities that were exposed by the pandemic in, among other things, housing, income, employment, healthcare, continual police violence against black and brown people, and of course a deadly insurrection that was rooted in white supremacy. And so, despite this revelation of this pandemic, we are currently in a moment when many government officials are vociferously denying that systemic racism even exists, even as they are ardently working to shore it up. So take, for example, that as of now, lawmakers across 48 states have introduced hundreds of bills that would restrict voting in manners that would disproportionately, and I would argue to some degree deliberately, affect people of color most. And as a historian, I can tell you that systemic racism thrives on and indeed requires disenfranchisement. Historically speaking, however, there is no better indication of a grab for power than the attempt to outlaw knowledge, as is the case right now with conservatives lobbying to prohibit discussions and histories about racism. And these are discussions and histories that just happen to be necessary to surmounting the inequities that undergird their power and position. So in light of these recent anti-racism campaigns, I found it remarkable that a week ago this last Thursday, Congress voted overwhelmingly to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Because those lawmakers who oppose what they spuriously call critical race theory, but supported Juneteenth becoming a national holiday, clearly have no understanding of this holiday, its history, or its meaning. If you don't know, because I never assume my audience what they do know, Juneteenth celebrates the date of June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, the westernmost slave state, and mandated the freedom of Texas's enslaved population of 250,000 people. And this was 2.5 years after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And so many people regard June 19, 1865 as the date that emancipation was actually realized in the United States. And for that reason, many African Americans embrace Juneteenth, not the 4th of July, as Independence Day. Of course, the humility. By making Juneteenth a federal holiday, Congress institutionalized its national significance, which as a historian and a Black person thrills me, because knowingly or not, they have legitimated Juneteenth as a Trojan horse through which the very discussions and histories of race they would deny will enter school curriculums and our national story. Because understanding Juneteenth requires, or at least allows for, recognition of the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the Confederate States, and only those Confederate states that were not under control of the Union Army. And that even after the Confederacy surrendered, slaveholders kept moving west, as far west as they could, in an effort to outrun the Union Army and keep their property, by which I mean enslaved blacks. And that the enslaved population in the border states did not experience emancipation until passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, which occurred 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And that the 13th Amendment includes an exception that allows for slavery as a punishment for a crime, which allowed for the immediate re-enslavement of many African Americans and facilitated their mass incarceration going forward. And that white supremacists' determination to roll back Black freedom after the Civil War gave rise to policies and practices that continue to impose on Black Americans freedom in all manners, in all sorts of manners. And it's these aspects of our nation's unique history of race that made it such that Douglass's 1852 query about the meaning of July 4th to Black Americans remained supremely relevant after the abolition of slavery, and, more to the point, make that same question relevant now. Thank you. So now I will begin the reading of this essay, What to the American Slave is the 4th of July. Mr. President, friends, fellow citizens, the task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way, for it is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is, to me, a matter of astonishment as well as gratitude. This, for the purposes of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Fellow citizens, the simple story is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government. England as the fatherland, although a considerable distance from your home, impose in the exercise of its parental prerogatives upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as, in its mature judgment, it deemed wise, right, and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the idea of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn. Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers become restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we, at this distance of time, regard it. The timid and the prudent of the day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful. But amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on, and the country with it.
On the 2nd of July, 1776, the old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of a national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. We seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day whose transparency is all equal, that it resolved that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown. Citizens, your fathers made good that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, and the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their brave deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests, and all will concede that it is a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man who it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked down their lives their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country.
They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled. That was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. Fully appreciating the hardships to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them, your fathers, the fathers of this republic, laid the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers, unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout attitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light, and my burden easy and delightful. But such is not the state of case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us.
The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just.
I fancy I hear someone of my audience say, "It is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the fields, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man."
For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the black race. It is not astonishing that, while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation, as better beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be misunderstood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans to show that men are a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant to their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply.
What, then, remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? I cannot. The time for such argument is past. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and I could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Take the American slave trade, which is especially prosperous just now, and carried on in all the large towns and cities in one half of this Confederacy. In several states, this trade is a chief source of wealth. It is called the internal slave trade in order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. That trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy, as an inexorable traffic. To arrest it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the east coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhumane traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and man. It is, however, a noticeable fact that while so much execration is poured out by Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable. Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade. The American slave trade sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country, the crowd, the highways of this nation, with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh drovers, armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave markets at New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton fields and the deadly sugar mill. Mark the sad procession as it moves warily along and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There, see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you will, upon the young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of her babe in her arms. See too that girl of 13 weeping Yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly, you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank, and the chains rattle simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with her babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains, and that gash on her shoulder tells her to move on.
Follow the drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever, and never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from that scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where, under the sun, you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking. Yet this is but a glance at the American slave trade, as it exists at this moment in the United States. Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is, today, in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wail of a fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets, where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men. By an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States. The power is coextensive with the Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not sacred. He is a bird for the sportsman's gun. By that most foul and fiendish of all human decrees, the liberty and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad republican domain is hunting ground for men. Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state enforce, as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country, and to your God, that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have, within the past 2 years, been hunted down and, without a moment's warning, hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children dependent on them for bread, but of this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage, and to all rights in this republic, the rights of God included.
For black men, there are neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The fugitive state law makes mercy to them a crime, and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and $5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any two villains is insufficient, under this hell-black enactment, to send the most pious and exemplary black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witnesses for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side, and that side is the side of the oppressor. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let there be thundered around the world in this tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic Christian America. The seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound, in deciding in the case of a man's liberty, to hear only his accusers. In glaring violation of this justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive state law, slave law, stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion,
are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crown-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves content to be the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad. Honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from your old land, you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill.
You discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor, yet you sustain a system which, in its very essence, casts a stigma upon labor. You can bear your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another, yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. You declare before the world, and are understood by the world to declare, that you hold these truths self-evident, and that all men are created equal, and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than the ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose, a 7th part of the inhabitants of your country. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. Be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever.
Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. I, therefore, leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. The time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it, God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow. In every crime be understood the claims of human brotherhood, and each return for evil good, not blow for blow. That day will come all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend each foe.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to recognize all of our readers by name. And readers, if you're still here, please do stand when you hear your name. First, I'll mention our three special guest readers. We have historian Brenna Greer. We have a special guest, clap. And we have a special guest from Natick for Black Lives Matter, Dan Sidney, if he's still here. But we'll clap for Dan. A special guest reader from Natick is United, Lee Manuel. And our teen readers, we have Gia Kumar, Hildy Wicks, Hayden Brown, Bella Kumar, Marley Wiest, and Ben Feldman. Many thanks to all of you who read. I'll say again, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and read words written so long ago and yet still so present in 2021. Thanks to all of you for being here. We appreciate it, and we'll hope to see you back next year. Thank you. And if I could just quietly ask all the readers to gather up in front of the peace chairs so we can take a photo, we would be grateful to you. Thank you again.